everyone. There he is.
Ah, how
Hey,
nice.
Cow.
Tom, I used to have dogs, and then once they died, I just never ever like wanted animals again. But I love having like company, you know?
Yes, well,
Is
they
it
are.
like raising kids?
Yes, they are remarkably like that, and cleaning up vomit and things like that. And they
Uh,
say, I do that.
okay, maybe I don't want that actually.
Well, that's part of life. In any case, you're going to start with an introduction and all of that good
Yes,
stuff.
yes. So if you just give me a minute. Hello, everyone. I know you guys have been watching for a while. Welcome to this training on free market ideals and free market principles in the face of economic nationalism. As you all know, this is going to be used as your first training model, not to get you to think in a specific way, but to help you appreciate other ways of thinking about liberty and of thinking about principles like property rights. So today we are very blessed to be joined by Dr. Tom G. Palmer, who is a distinguished figure in the field of classical liberal and libertarian thought, renowned for his extensive work as an author, theorist, and advocate for economic and political freedoms across the globe. Dr. Palmer currently serves as the Executive Vice President for International Programs at the Atlas Network, where he holds the George M. Yeager Chair for Advancing Liberty, and he's also a Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute. A few of you guys watching would have already engaged with some of the Cato Institute's content. He's also a prominent libertarian think tank, and prior to his current roles, he served as the vice president of the Institute for Humane Studies at George Mason University. His career has been dedicated to promoting liberal democracy and locally led economic development, working extensively with NGOs across Brazil, Argentina, Poland, Cameroon, you name it, even before the dissolution of the USSR. Tom has also been recognized for his lifelong work, notably receiving the 2021 Sir Anthony Fisher Achievement Award for planting and watering the seeds of globally. I'd like to remind us that unlike us who are at desks and walking around towns, Tom actually smuggled books back in a few decades ago, at the height of the Cold War, to spread liberal ideas across the world. And so he's been advocating for this, not only sitting on an armchair, but also working on the ground to actually make liberal ideas a reality. So welcome, Tom.
Well, thank you for this opportunity and a chance to meet, in a way, the staff of CEPI. So it's an honor to be with you today.
Yes, well, Jamon was here earlier, but none of them will be joining us today. I just so that we can record this for the training. But I'm hoping that they would meet you in the future. I'm sure they will meet you in the future.
Super.
So I'd like to jump right into it, Tom. The post-war consensus of liberal democracies, free trade, free markets, and the embrace of classical liberal economics is under threat from economic nationalism. Now, developed countries, in particular the US and the EU, are increasingly using protectionist tools like subsidies, domestic content requirements, strategic trade barriers, technical trade barriers, etc. So, what I would like for us to do today is to help our laureates and our fellows better understand how to think about free market ideas in the context of economic nationalism, because there is a risk that because the US and Europe and Japan might have broad industrial policies that close them off from the rest of the world, Africa might start to do the same. So before we get started with questions, maybe give us your first thoughts and then we're going to go into the questions.
Okay, well, I'm going to start a little bit rude for a guest, but just to challenge part of your opening. You talked about the post-war consensus, and I think that's actually not quite right. It's so often spoken of that way, but there were lots of places that did not adopt these policies and they remained poor. So it was those countries that adopted policies of more open trade, whether they were in Asia, Europe, the Americas, or Africa, did better, and those that didn't lagged behind. So there was not a policy
Like
consensus, but we
Cuba
saw
and yes,
Cuba, and
again,
then
Venezuela, etc.
these terrible ideas persist. They need to be refreshed regularly. People have to remind themselves, why are some people rich and other people are poor? Why are some countries wealthy and others lag behind in misery and poverty? And unfortunately, many intellectuals assume they're so clever that they know how to make a country rich, if only you gave them absolute power. So this is a constant issue. It'll never go away, that arrogant people will assume if I were the boss, everything would be awesome. But that's not how the world works. So let's start with what made wealthy countries wealthy. And that's the most important question in economics. People began to ask, why were some countries pulling beyond others? And this happened, by the way, very importantly, in the Netherlands. It was a very interesting case study going back to the 17th and 18th centuries. People thought countries became rich because they had gold, diamonds, big armies, or lots of land. The Netherlands didn't have any gold, no diamonds. They didn't have a giant army, and they didn't even have any land. It's
Yes,
called the Netherlands, means it's the Low
it's
Countries, it's
below
below sea
sea level.
level.
Yes, yes, that's
So
true.
they have to create land. So what made them wealthy? And people began to ask, that's puzzling. Why are the Dutch, who don't have anything, the richest people in Europe? And what was it? Freedom to trade, security of property, the rule of law, accountable government. These elements were really important. So it turns out that what makes a country rich isn't oil in the ground or diamonds or
It's not
gold.
just resources,
It's not resources,
yeah,
it's institutions and human behavior.
okay.
And that's rooted in the protection of individual freedom, the freedom to try something new, to innovate, to introduce a new product, a new idea, a new way of doing business, a new way of organizing activity, and see if it works. So, freedom, it turns out, is the most important resource of all. It's worth so much more than gold or diamonds or oil or uranium and so on.
Yeah.
It's freedom.
So it gives us freedom essentially. That freedom allows individuals to decide what products they want to produce. And in turn, people develop the ability to do it well, and that benefits the consumer. But before we get to that, Tom, I'm just going to follow our very strict list. But there'll be largely, you can keep the answer short because there'll be a lot of time for you to give us a much more profound and pointy lecture. So historically, free markets were seen as the engine for peace and efficiency. But unfortunately, now countries are beginning to think about or trying to implement state intervention and import substitution. In your view, especially for us in Africa, you've given us a few examples across the world where countries who were open have been much more successful. In Africa's current context of colonialism and Pan-Africanism and all these intellectual ideas that Africans have to now grapple with and the economic realities, why is it important that we continue advocating for free market ideas?
Oh, this is a really key question. Africa was the one that was in some ways left behind in the big increase in international trade. Africa has the highest trade barriers in the world, and it's particularly difficult to trade with other Africans. So, in many cases, it's easier to trade from an African country with people in the UK,
In
the
Europe, in Asia, in
Union,
fact,
US,
yes,
but not with the country next door,
not with Nigeria
not
or
with the.
Gabon or Central African Republic, because, yes,
That's right. It's more difficult to trade 75 kilometers across that border than 3,000 kilometers around the world. And it's because of bad policies. And in my opinion, Africans will benefit when they begin to open up their continent to trade and realize the tremendous gains from the division of labor, from the opportunity for adopting better practices. Some new innovation that comes about in Malawi might be copied in Cote d'Ivoire and then copied in Cameroon or Nigeria. And that happens
Absolutely.
when people can
Can I
trade.
just
That's
explain
really
as
the
well,
key.
Tom? You know that this is how China became competitive, right? Because a lot of the technology, a lot of the iPhones, the machines, etc., that were going into China, where people actually learned how to do them, and then it caused them to innovate faster. So the from the diffusion from trade actually causes innovation to accelerate at a much
Yeah.
faster pace. And it's much cheaper for someone to see a phone and say, how can I make that? As opposed to try and impose a set of policies for them to make that phone, right?
But also, it's not only coming into Africa, it's going from Africa out as well. Look at the innovation in cell phone telephony payment systems. So in Kenya, this started out with M-Pesa. People were saying, I'm in Nairobi. I want to be able to talk to my mother in the village. So I have to send her money to buy telephone credits. So you have to find a bus driver, et cetera, very complicated. Instead, people figured out, well, wait a minute, I could buy phone credits and transfer to them to her. And then I can talk to my mom regularly. Well, it turns out people then discovered, hey, wait, I can trade those phone credits to other people in exchange. And that is how this system of micropayments emerged. So you could go to a kiosk, you could buy some aspirin or some medicine and so on with money with your phone. It was an astonishing innovation, and it is spread around the world. It made life so much more awesome. I use it all the time. And this was an innovation that was discovered by accident. It was not the original intention of the plan, but people discovered another use. It's an awesome innovation. And this is what we need to see more of that happening, more of the division of labor, more of the benefits of trade. And as Adam Smith said, the division of labor is limited by the extent of the market. So if you're in Togo and you can only trade with people in Togo, well, that's not a very big market. When you can trade with all of Africa and all of the world, the opportunities for additional value added, which means higher wages and higher living standards, are spectacular.
Right, Tom. Thank you for that. So developing countries are at crossroads, right? High debt levels, low productivity, manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, which isn't growing substantially. And governments think that the answer is import substitution, which it's not. And unfortunately, the wrong examples from South Korea are drawn. So from a classical liberal perspective, how do we now reconcile the national self-interest with, the liberal perspective?
Well, the first thing is to realize that anytime two people voluntarily trade, they did it for mutual benefit. When people focus only on manufacturing, they reveal a really primitive bias that somehow only factories create value. But that's not true. The Netherlands became wealthy partly through the sale of flowers. So it's a
So
produced good.
is Kenya as well?
Kenya is growing from that also. Think about New Zealand. New Zealand produces fantastic fruit, wine, which is basically old grape juice, and lamb all around the world. The bulk of their exports are agricultural. They're not manufactured televisions and things like that. Canada is a big agricultural exporter, and the United States as well. So it's not manufacturing versus agriculture. You can become prosperous from agriculture as well. It's letting the market determine where you add value. That's really the key. And so it's a terrible shame that people look down on agriculture as somehow not important. A, we have to eat. B, you can grow more than you need to eat. You can sell the
Sell
surplus
some
to other
surplus, yes.
people and then get the gains from what they've produced. So think about the New Zealanders. It's a very wealthy country,
Yep. And they make
but
great white wine,
they don't
wine,
make
wine.
airplanes or things like that.
Yes, absolutely.
They're exporting mainly agricultural goods and fish.
Right. So, from what I gather, it's important for us to find out, we should allow the market to decide where the competitive
Yeah.
advantage comes from. and then leverage that to grow and to become much more competitive. Because value is everywhere. It's about finding out where it can be got most efficient.
No,
Well,
that's right. And the only way you can find your comparative advantage is in the competition of the market. The president of the country or the prime minister or the minister of commerce, they don't know that. They might make a guess, but the chances of them being right are
yeah,
extremely tiny.
very, very.
Almost certainly they will get it wrong.
So, now, advanced economies have utilized things like the CHIPS Act, green subsidies, and, the European Union, for example, the subsidies to farmers are the size of the equivalent of South Africa's budget. So, um, for developing countries who are being told by the IMF, well, subsidies are distortive, um, how can we make a better case for less use of subsidies? Because in Cameroon, it's becoming so prevalent, from the oil company to the national banks to 98% of state-owned companies who are loss-making and draining well over 6% of the state budget every year. These companies are failing, and the government is pouring money into them through subsidies. So, why are subsidies sometimes bad, and
I,
how can we
I think
use them much more effectively?
I I think they're basically always bad. It's one thing to have a state expenditure for a truly public benefit, like a road system or police or courts or national defense or some kind of infrastructure, when it's a public good that everyone will benefit from. But a subsidy is taking money out of one pocket and putting it into another. The vast majority of people are hurt by these, and a small number, usually the owners, the managers, are benefited from them. But that is wealth that they got at the expense of their fellow citizens. It was not a net addition to wealth. The key thing to think about is not what a wealthy country is doing now, because if you're very rich, you can afford to do stupid things. You can you have enough of a surplus that
Yes,
bad policies don't land you in the poorhouse or
yes,
in
yes.
starvation.
It's like just having like the US dollar, which allows you to borrow very cheaply from across the world. It allows the US to make certain mistakes which Cameroon cannot afford. And so
Well,
we have to think,
even that's not the only thing. Think about a currency that's not a national reserve currency, like the British pound, for instance, which is internationally traded, but it doesn't have the status of the dollar. It
yeah,
did many, many
it
years
did many
ago.
years ago. Yes, yes.
But
It
the,
says at
the
5%
key is
equivalent.
not that. The key is already being rich. I can afford to lose some of my wealth and not go to the poorhouse. But if you're poor, don't do that. So, what we need to do is to study those wealthy countries. What did they do when they were in the process of escaping poverty and becoming wealthy? And it wasn't subsidies, it was open market competition. Now that they're rich, they can afford interest groups lobbying for subsidies. And the Common Agricultural Policy and the European Union is a good example of that. It raises the price paid for food by Europeans. It makes them poorer in order to keep people producing sheep or strawberries, whatever is the subsidized good. In the United States, we see this as another example, the restrictions on sugar imports. Americans pay about twice the world price for sugar.
Oh,
Most people don't know that because the burden is distributed over a big population over a whole year. Every time you put a little bit of sugar in your tea, it costs you a tiny amount of money. But add that up over 335 million people and lots of cups of tea and candy bars and so on. And that means subsidies for a small number of special interests. And they have lobbyists in Washington, D.C., and they lobby for it. They benefit. But all the rest of the American sugar consumers are losing money. They're paying double
it's
for
much more
sugar.
expensive for them. So,
And then it had another thing that they didn't think about. It turns out, this is a surprise to many, that there's an industry that uses sugar as a major ingredient. It's called the candy industry.
yeah.
And suddenly, American candy producers found themselves paying twice as
Twice the
much for
price for
sugar
sugar.
as Canadian, Mexican, Belgian, and so on.
Whereas if they just opened the market, they would have been able to buy sugar at a lower cost, and that would have been
Absolutely.
better for their margins, as opposed to allowing them, forcing them to buy expensive sugar and then trying
It
to
put them out of
subsidize
business.
them.
They couldn't compete. And so what happened is a lot of candy is imported into the US, but they don't pay the sugar subsidy. They produce it in Canada. It's kind of like thinking Canadians are smuggling sugar into the United States in the form of candy. But the American candy producers were put out of business. So you protected people in the sugar producing industry, but you unemployed people in the sugar consuming industries, and you lowered the purchasing power of all of the consumers. This was not a net addition to wealth. All subsidies are like that. If you have a subsidy for this company, it's going to be at the expense of somebody else.
Okay, but
Somebody
Tom,
else is going to be harmed.
right, for most businesses in Africa unfortunately see subsidies like candy, right? And so, given the fact that free market advocates try to make the market environment better, um, when you come across business, the business community, they see it as favorable. And so how do we convince them long term that it's better for us not to have subsidies because it's distortive?
Oh, that's a very good question. And actually, I would recommend, and you might want to watch with your colleagues, the New Zealand Story, which is a documentary on public broadcasting in the United States that I was involved in, and addressed that very question. There were massive subsidies to New Zealand agriculturalists, to farmers and sheep raisers and so on. And they were all cut to zero. And it was very hard for 2 years. But you will not find a New Zealand farmer who wants to go back to the old system. Why? Because they began to produce for the market, and they were looking for those things where they added the most value added. And they become fabulously prosperous with zero subsidies. So New Zealand agriculture was not doing well for a long time with subsidies. They got rid of them. It was a tough 2 years for them to adapt, but the consequence was an absolute takeoff in productivity and income in New Zealand. One way to think about restrictions on trade, because often these subsidies take the form not just of a cash payment, a transfer from the taxpayer to this company or person, but also restrictions on the ability of people to buy from abroad. There's something called the learner symmetry thesis in international trade economics, that if a restriction is placed on imports, it has in the aggregate the same impact as a restriction on exports. And if you think about it, it makes sense. Exports are the price we pay to get imports. What we want are the imports.
Yes, so you sell goods to be able to buy what we import.
Right.
Yes.
In effect, we buy our imports with our exports. When you make it harder to import, you're making it harder to export as well. And so the consequence is, although you may be protecting people in import competitive industries through import substitution, you're destroying jobs in your export industry. And those are the ones that added more value in exchange. Foreigners wanted to get those things. So the consequence is a lowering of wages. The actual value produced is now made lower rather than higher. People sometimes don't see that because they see people demanding this protection. They say, oh, it must be a good thing. Yeah, it's
Well,
good for them, but
yes, I
it's
mean
harmful for others.
for in Cameroon currently, they haven't made it law yet, but the largest producer of sugar, Susukam, they don't produce up to 50% of what the country needs. They produce about 45%. They've written a letter to the government asking the government to block imports so that they can sell their products more effectively across the markets. Now, bearing in mind that the government earns about 12% of this company, and the rest is owned by the French and a few private investors. The government thinks it's a good idea. Oh, wow, we're going to have control of our markets. We can increase production. But we've not been able to increase production for 38 years to be able to satisfy local demand. So, now we are, well, the offensive is to ensure that they understand that if they reduce choice, then prices will rise for all consumers, and we don't want
Exactly.
inflation. Um,
Well, it's not an inflationary policy, it's a transfer policy. Prices will go up in that industry. But it also means, given that I have so much money to spend, prices for something else will fall. The revenues of other people will go down.
oh, yes, yes,
It's
of
a
course.
transfer within the society. Although in this case of French owners, it's a transfer of resources to wherever they live in France. So basically, what it is when they say, oh, we want to increase production, what they're saying is, we want to raise the price you pay. We want Cameroonians to pay more, which is to say, a bigger fracture of their income.
Of
So
their
if you have this
incomes,
much income
just
and you
for a bit
take
of
a bigger piece
yeah,
for
currently
the
if they're
same
paying
thing,
so currently if they're paying, let's say 1% of their income, this policy could actually make them pay up to 3% because sugar is
right?
used in everything from bread to dough balls, which people consume a lot, to drinks, and it could raise the cost for other sectors. The beverage industry, candy, like you mentioned earlier. So that if the cascading effects are just going to be there. But
You
the
you you
challenge, the
you
challenge
lower the real wages of labor by doing that. Wages are made to fall
yeah.
because the amount of money you earn buys less when those prices go up.
Okay, Tom, can you just repeat that? So wages fall generally when prices go up because
Well,
businesses,
real wages,
real
real
wages.
wage.
Yes,
So
yes.
that's the key. So there's nominal wages, which under inflation can go
It's
way up.
unadjusted for,
Right? The
yes.
government prints money and suddenly you're earning $500 trillion because they're printed money.
Then,
This is what happened in Zimbabwe, it happened in Hungary, it happened in Germany, it happened in China, any place you have these hyperinflations. So nominal wages with numbers on them, more and more zeros go up. But what we're interested in is real wages. What can I buy with the wages I receive for a day's work? Right? That's the question.
adjusting for inflation, essentially.
Set aside that. Just if I earn $10 a day, what can I buy? And if my $10 buys less, means my real wages went down. If it buys more, it means they went up. When you force people to pay these higher prices by restricting competition, you caused my wages to fall. I'm able to buy less
Okay.
than I could have before this restriction in supply. So
So,
this really is a transfer of wealth from the mass of the Cameroonian people to those people who have lobbyists and pull in the government.
okay. Well, we're going to, so I think that was a mouthful. But now for small and emerging economies, there's a new concept of friendshoring, nearshoring, which under the African Continental Free Trade Area, it's touted as an opportunity for African countries who trade mostly industrialized products. Now, does this pose a risk? Because it could amplify intra-African trade, which is a good thing, Africans trading with their neighbors. But does it pose a risk to global trade? Because whilst we might see an increase in total merchandise trade, we might see regions trading more within themselves and little blocks forming.
Not if there's free trade. So the answer to that is no, under the conditions that people can trade either with a neighboring African country or with a Latin American country or an Asian country. And then you see that competition means that everyone is striving to add the highest value with the products that they're producing. So if there's greater trade, let's say within the United States, there are no internal trade barriers between states, between California and New York and Michigan
Oh,
and so on.
yes.
Zero. They're just zero. That is not harmful to other people. It means that there's a big market, an internal market. When Europe went to removing internal barriers to trade in the European Union and travel, by the way, it did not lead to a diminution in global trade.
Yes,
They
that's
can
true.
both go up.
If
They
anything,
can,
the European Union share of manufacturing at the time was much higher, but it was equally becoming much more integrated, right? The manufact
well, again,
their share of global GDP, so regardless of them becoming much more integrated, they still traded with the world, and in fact, they had a higher share of global trade. So the fact that countries become integrated doesn't necessarily mean, well, correct me if I'm wrong, Tom, but the fact that countries become much more integrated doesn't mean that they close their borders and they stop trading with the rest of the world.
No, not at all. Now, there's a couple of things that I wanted to focus on, though. Manufacturing is not what we should be thinking about. We should be thinking about value added. Tourism is value added. There are some countries that have become wealthy through tourism. What do they export? Memories, experiences, right? That's what they're exporting, not widgets or
Yes, not
radios.
laptops and phones and radios and TVs, because not
Right.
everyone should and can make that. Countries should leverage their competitive advantage,
Their comparative advantage
their
is the key.
comparative advantage.
Comparative advantage. And when they do that, it means that there are gains from trade for all the parties involved, that they're gaining. That's why they're engaging in the trade. So the first thing is, I think we should stop thinking about just manufacturing. That's an
Yes.
old mentality. It's value added, which can be tourism, it can be services. The
Services,
U.S. is
yeah.
a
It
huge
could be
exporter of services.
education, tourism, financial
Education.
services. Like the example you gave of M-Pesa is such an important example for us because in Cameroon it's the same with mobile money services where you
Mhm,
have over 60% of adults who own a mobile money account and can send and
mhm.
receive money, can pay school fees, can buy medications, but fewer adults actually earn a formal bank account. So,
Right.
this innovation can come from many places, and competitiveness and value could come from many places, not just
Oh,
manufacturing.
absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And and so think about when engaging in trade, where do I add the most value? That's the question, not does it make a lot of smoke or big noise or have a factory and so on. So call centers were another important innovation. In India, they had an English-speaking population. They had an educated population, increasingly so. And the time difference from Europe and North America meant people could call up and get solutions to their software problems. So I could be calling up and it's 8 o'clock at night for me and
And
middle
someone who can actually respond to your query. Yes, loads
yeah,
of banks, loads of manufacturing companies outsource their call centers to India. And so they were
India,
able
but
to
also
actually,
Ireland.
yeah,
Ireland is a big call center
okay,
country. And so what are they exporting? Well, they're exporting voices, knowledge, people solving your problems.
problem
They say,
solving,
hello,
customer
how can I help you?
service. Yes.
And so if you listen sometimes doing that, you hear accents that are Filipino, South Asian, Irish, um, and it doesn't matter where they are. They're solving my problem when I'm dealing with something, and they're making a good living in doing so. So services, tourism, uh, banking, all kinds of services of that sort, as well as manufacturing.
Education, even
Yes,
yes, education, all the services can also play a very important role because this is what
and agriculture. We should not forget agriculture. That's the one
I
that most people leave behind as somehow, oh, that's backward. Well, you don't grow food, you don't eat, and you can grow rich growing food. I'll tell you one thing that Africa has suffered from is the lack of integration of agricultural markets because large scale commercial farming is harder in much of Africa
yes.
because of the trade barriers. It means it's harder to achieve those economies of scale.
It's
And if they were able to really realize the continental free trade area, I think that agriculture would really take off in Africa and become
Absolutely, because
a world leader.
more and more people are industrializing agriculture. Avocados are made in Kenya. Cameroon is now making increasingly its own tomatoes and green peppers, things which it used to import before. And the trade barriers are actually what prevent individuals and businesses from investing in agriculture, partly because if you're in the Western region and you want to sell to Nigeria and you have to go through the ECOC border, even if you have a refrigerated truck, just the wait at the border alone, which sometimes could be 5 minutes or sometimes could be 16 hours, cause a lot of food spoilage. And so one of the products that we produce, which is cassava, it's used to make flakes, used to make like local foods. That's perhaps one of the only products that we produce enough of, but about 35 to 40% gets lost only in transport, which is unfortunate. And so in that case, is it just a question of reducing the barriers to trade, or is it also making an enabling environment for trade, like investing in roads, ports, infrastructure, electricity, etc.?
Well, the two can go together. So the first thing is not having people stick a machine gun in your face and demand money, which happens sometimes at borders. And I've had friends who have traveled through Africa, African friends, who said, we're sorry we're late, but we spent 32 hours at a border with armed men demanding money from us. So it is a reality in parts of Africa. So you want to get rid of that. You should be able to drive from one place to another. So maybe there's a passport check, but why should that have to be onerous? Why not have just a border crossing card, if even that, and just take your goods in and sell them? And without all the stultifying paperwork, which was a residue of the colonial system, one of the things the colonialists left behind was paperwork, government forms, unbelievable.
Bureaucracy and huge administrations.
Well, and think about, as an example, in Burundi, you had to prove when you were exporting eggs to a neighboring country, you had to have a certificate of origin to prove that the eggs were laid by proud Burundian hens. Well, really, who cares? I mean, who cares?
No one does.
You had to go get a form with stamps on it that they would say, yes, these are Burundian eggs, or they're confiscated at the border and smashed.
Which makes no sense. It's a loss for the entrepreneur, but also for regardless of whatever revenue they wanted to make, it's a loss equally for the same, for the government. And the issue of certificates of origin actually haven't stopped. They're now becoming much more ubiquitous. But it's true that with the AFCFTA, they're trying to simplify it a little bit, a few pages. But the burden of proof, if I want to export orange juice and you ask me to prove that they're from Cameroon, going to take professional pictures, taking pictures of the process and all of that, it's a lot more expensive for the entrepreneur. And so that's a barrier that we should actively address. But are some of these non-tariff barriers essential? Because if you come to Cameroon and you go into a shop, when you come to Cameroon and you go and you pick up an apple, I do want the apple to be safe. And so sometimes this certificate means that the apples have been tested for pesticides or other things. So
then you have the same standards as you have for local apples, and that's it.
Okay, so you set the same standards, and then do you set the same standards and streamline them, or do you impose the rigorous standards on the local markets? Because after all, the foods have to be safe, right?
If my fear is that I'm going to eat an apple and drop dead for some reason, well, I don't really care if it's a locally grown apple or an imported apple. If that's the issue, they should all be subject to the same rules. The fear that people have is foreign apples, that somehow they're scarier, but they're not. They should just have the same principles applying to the foreign apples as to the local apples. If it's something I should be able to consume if it's locally made and it meets the standard, why not have the same standard for the apple that's grown 400 kilometers away?
Okay.
And I think that should be the standard around the case. Now, here's an important idea that the Republic of Georgia implemented. It's a small country. They had extremely onerous inspections of everything for health and safety, according to their own Georgian standards. And the government there, under reformer, led by Kakhe Bendukidze, was the man's name, said, that's stupid. Why don't we do this? If you can prove that your product has met the standards of the European Union, Japan, Korea, Singapore, United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Brazil, it's good enough to bring it here.
I mean,
Our
that's
so
almost
what they did,
impossible.
no, any one of those,
Oh, anyone. Okay, right,
and
right.
no, not all of them, of course, that's crazy.
Okay.
But if it meets the standards of Japan and it's been certified by Japan, then that's fine. If it's good enough for Japanese people, it's good enough for Georgians.
It's good enough for
Japanese
Europe. It's
people have,
good. Yes, yes, yes. Exactly.
right. So
Yeah.
you basically outsource a substantial amount of that health and safety inspection burden. If
Yeah.
they can show that this has passed those standards, then we don't have to retest it according to our unique, quirky, unusual standards here.
Yes,
And
yes,
so,
especially for fruits. You know that South Africa is currently at the WTO with the European Union because apparently when they export citrus fruit, which is about 40% goes to the European Union, when they export it, sometimes on arrival it has some black spots. But the black spots have been scientifically proven not to have a material impact on health. So there's no scientific basis for restricting trade. And this is just one example. And yeah, and so sometimes the standards can end up impeding trade, risking 16,000 jobs in some places. And so it's important for us to make it as easy as possible for businesses to export. But Tom, we've gone a bit off topic. We're coming back. Now, I just so in your view, what practical measures can we take? Because like you said, the first thing is that we should move away from this obsession with manufacturing and think about creating value from what we have, right? And also fully leverage the service sector, which is something which we tend to shy away from. All we think about is like making things. So with that being said, like in the face of economic nationalism, the United States not renewing AGOA for now. For example, how should African countries adapt, other than just saying, well, the African Continental Free Trade Area is such an opportunity. How can African governments begin thinking about how to mitigate the impacts of nationalism?
the first thing is not to respond with foolishness with your own foolishness. So if President Trump, for example, imposes taxes on the American people, which he has done, and the Supreme Court is, by the way, reviewing this issue because it's blatantly unconstitutional and illegal.
Yes.
But he imposed unilaterally hundreds of billions of dollars of taxes on Americans. Well, that's also harmful to people who export to the American market because now they find that they're not able to sell because there's 100% tariff. So something that they sold for $10, now there's another $10 added onto it that goes to the government, and people decide not to buy it. What should other people do
It
in
makes
other
trade
countries?
not worth it.
Yes, that's basically right. Now, one response is to say, oh, yeah, you just poked yourself in the eye. Now I'm going to poke myself in the eye.
That's what
But
the
that's
US and
stupid.
China did for like the longest time. And, we're all exhausted by it, really. But it's really
That kind of trade retaliation is foolish because you're saying if Henri taxes himself, then Tom should tax Tom as well. It doesn't make any sense. If you slap yourself in the face, I should slap myself. Why
oh,
should I
yeah,
do that?
exactly.
Much better instead to say, look, let's look to places that are willing to trade with us. Where can we get the best prices for our goods? And how do we do that? We can open our markets to their markets, lower the price of imports, increasing our export business in the process, because that's how you pay for imports, and increasing our wages and our economic productivity.
Yeah.
So it would be much better to look to deepening intra-African trade, more trading with the European Union, with Latin America, with Mercosur, with Asian countries. If the US says we're going to impose a crazy tariff on you, I think that's foolish on the part of President Trump. I totally oppose that. I think it's not only illegal, but it's stupid. But I would encourage Africans to respond by
We
being
agree.
smart. I
We
mean, if
agree,
someone
but
else is stupid, be smart.
Yes, yes. I mean, Africans are increasingly looking to trade with other partners, right? We are just worried that there's this new, and there's nothing wrong with it, but there's this new like Chinese affinity that is like sweeping through Africa with the Belt and Road Initiative, and they're like, well, if 60% of our external debt is owed to China, we might as well just trade more with them. But unfortunately, but it's important for African countries to maintain that balance, right? To trade with the European Union, to trade with Asia, to trade with, Canada and North America when it's eventually ready to, Latin America. And the faster we do that, the quicker we're going to learn. Because if you don't
Yes,
get industrial machinery from Germany or solar panels from Europe, it has to go bad and someone has to come and figure out how to fix it. And that's how they learn and that's how they can eventually replicate. So, what we're proposing to policymakers very kindly is that we develop the sectors of our industries that they want to develop because all they care about is input substitution. But at the same time, we shouldn't do that at the expense of trade. And we should allow consumers to benefit, to buy the products they want from wherever they want. We should allow companies to trade, to trade the products and the services they want from wherever they want, and really bringing down those barriers. Because, yeah, the tax revenue just, it's not all it's made out to be. The revenues from import duties that we've had them for 42 years, and what has changed materially? There's other ways to raise revenue, right? And
yes.
if more businesses are registered and more businesses are engaging in trade, then the government makes a net positive benefit over the long run, through income taxes, through corporation taxes, and so they don't have to get it from the product at the border.
And it's much better if there's going to be state investment that it go into general infrastructure, roads, electrification, water control systems, flood control, those sorts of things, and then let people through the market determine where they're likely to add the most value. And
Right.
through competition, find out this worked, but that didn't. That means do more of this and less of that. This is the one where you're making more money. And that applies to the whole economy, not only to those that engage in trade across borders, but within the country as well.
Okay.
So that it's, I think, a big mistake to think that government bureaucrats or political figures are good investors,
Well, they're the
particularly when
worst.
they're investing someone else's money.
Yes.
If
I
they
mean,
were investing their own money and they got the benefit or bore the loss, okay, fine, let them do that. But instead, they're investing your money and they will skim off some of the profit in the form of corruption. And when it goes bust, you're stuck with the losses.
yeah.
So, not good investors.
So, Tom, like we've
Good
spoken a
investors
lot
in
about
infrastructure.
We've spoken a lot about trade, Tom. Can we spend like the next 3 minutes talking about property rights? Because the last time
Okay.
we had a conversation, you said something that like resonated with all of us. We've been advocating for property rights more from the perspective of equality, right?
Mhm.
And economic prosperity and economic inclusion. But you spoke about property rights being first and foremost about human dignity. Can
Yes, I
you
believe that very strongly. And if you think about the root of the idea, what is proper? Property is something that is proper to me. And we start with your property in your life, your property in your freedom. That is the foundation. And then we have property in stuff, right? There's my pen,
and
my apartment, my desk, and so on. Most people think only of that kind of property, but the foundation of property is your property in your own person. Other people don't own you. They cannot force you to do things. They cannot command you. They cannot say, down on your knees and kiss my feet. You don't have to do that. You are your own person. And that means you have a special role in the world. Everybody has that. But when someone comes away and takes from you the material things that are part of your life that you need to live and treat you as if you're nobody, they stripped you of your dignity. And so I think that the core benefit of property is human dignity. When people have that dignity, it means I matter. My choices count. People can't treat me as if I'm an object to be moved around at their will. That means that they can take initiative in their lives. They can make their lives better, the lives of their families, and the lives of their communities and nations. Those are the things that most people focus on as the benefit of property rights: greater investment, people
Higher
take care.
incomes,
Right. Those are
access
great.
to services. Yes, yes, yes.
Right. Awesome. But the key, the foundation, is the dignity of every human being, to have a property, as John Locke said, in your own person. That's the foundation of it. And it means when people address me, they don't treat me like a thing. They address me as an equal human being. And I think that's really foundational to the whole idea of a free society. And then those other things, rising incomes, better dental care, all those great things are the fruits of that, right? And I think that's just amazing and awesome. It then brings about an equalization. So today, people in poor countries receive better dental care than the richest people in the richest countries did only 40 years ago, or even less.
Yes,
You can
yes.
get you can get dental care in a low-income country that a billionaire would have loved to have had 30 years ago. Pain-free dentistry, all kinds of new techniques and so on that
Yeah.
were not available to anyone.
Replacing
But now,
cavities, changing types of teeth,
yeah.
veneers and whatnot. Yes, yes, absolutely.
And then think about this thing, right? If you went back to 1980, people would be amazed that you could have such a thing
Yeah.
that can do calculations and communications. You can watch
You call, you
movies
can
on it.
text, you can save information on it. You can, keep your friends' numbers off by heart and not have to wait,
And the
days and
richest
months
person in
for
the
a
world,
small text for yeah.
just not that long ago, the richest person in the world could not afford one. And
Yeah.
today we find them ubiquitous in low income countries as well as high income countries.
So so property rights, dignity first. We have to view humans as having that right implicitly, right? And for that right not to be able to be taken away from them by anyone. Now, okay, so I'd like us to talk about limited government now, Tom. So in Cameroon, every year the government's wage bill is increasing every single year by 18%, by 20%, it doesn't really matter. But every single year it's increasing. Now, it's caused us to push for limited government simply because the government is bloated and the quality of public services aren't really great. Their ability to follow through on public investment projects is completely absent, and they cannot create basic Excel and PowerPoint sheets, PowerPoint slides. That's what we were doing at the Global Environment Facility for the Ministry of Environment, because 48 million from advanced economies comes every other year, and projects are implemented, and nobody has there's no standardized way of collecting feedback to see how many women were impacted, how many men were impacted. And so that's essentially why we were there. And it got us to thinking that maybe limited government is really just a question of state capacity, because what we did in 2 weeks, which was unpaid, um, it takes people generally like 3 to 4 months for them to get it done, according to what the technical advisors tell us. So is limited government about efficiency, or is it about first and foremost just slashing the government size because we should assume that it's bloated? Oh my God.
I would start with slashing the government's powers. The most important thing is what powers do they exercise? And then the number of people they hire to carry them out is a secondary matter. It's important, but it's the secondary matter. The primary matter is what are they doing? If they're harassing people and expelling from their homes or meddling into their private affairs or dictating to them how they should live, they should stop that. They should do less of that. They might be well advised to do more of protecting people's rights, providing a secure legal framework for the enjoyment of life, liberty, and property and estate, providing the rule of law through a judicial system, and some limited category of authentically public goods like roads and
Street
transportation and so
lights
on.
and maybe some water fountains over there. Yep. So roads, public.
Something that actually the public benefits. It's not just giving from one group to another, but
Okay.
that is an actual public benefit. So they do too much of these things. It means they're doing too little of the others. Focus on the things that where they can actually add value, and the other things either get rid of them, or if it is a service that is not necessary for the state to provide, open it to competition. So in many countries, telephone service was a government monopoly for decades and decades and decades.
Until they
It was
outsource.
so inefficient. It took in Argentina 16 years to get a new phone line installed under the state socialist monopoly. People would buy an apartment because it had a phone in it, right? That
Gosh,
was the key thing, was you were
that's the
buying a
height of
phone.
inefficiency.
It was insane.
And it just goes to show that governments really sometimes, just they generally don't have the capacity and the agility to do things fast and well.
Well,
Right?
the big issue was
So,
they had a monopoly. It was a government monopoly. So
like
what
in
do they care?
Cameroon, yeah, like in Cameroon now, Camtel is a monopoly, and everybody,
Well,
and they've closed the markets to everyone, but Camtel, who is a government-owned company that manages everything, and there's only two other companies who operate on that network as well.
the key there is to do, for instance, we can take an example, Mexico and Guatemala. Mexico had a state monopoly phone system and they privatized it and maintained it as a monopoly. So Carlos Slim, one of the richest men in the world, owns it. Guatemala did the better approach. First, they opened telephone service with cell phone telephony to competitors. Many firms were able to set up and provide services in competition with the state company. Then they privatized the assets of the state company. That was smart. And the consequence was much better telephone service and much lower prices in Guatemala than in Mexico.
In Mexico, yeah, because you had
So
more businesses in the market fighting for consumers, or competing for
yes.
clients and thereby pushing the prices down for them.
And
Ultimately, it's the
innovation,
customer who benefits, but innovation,
right?
yes. Go on, Tom. You
So
forgot
the last
innovation.
thing
You
you
forgot
the
innovation.
last thing you want to do is you don't want to privatize a monopoly. That's a disaster. Open the monopolistic system to competition and then privatize the state firm. And I think that might be a good policy in Cameroon.
You said we don't want to privatize monopolies.
Yeah, don't let it keep the monopoly.
Yes,
First,
yes.
open it to competition so it's not a monopoly. Then the state firm that previously had the monopoly can be privatized when there are already multiple competitors.
Okay. So,
And
right, Tom, sorry to cut you. Did you have some last words about limited government before we move on to the rule of law?
okay, well, they're connected, and I'll have to sign off in a little bit because I
Yes,
have to get ready for
just
the
5
meeting.
more minutes, and then so
Yeah.
I just want to ask, what is the relationship between a free society and human flourishing? What's the relationship between a free society and a prosperous society? Are they interrelated?
They're very interrelated, and they are also, it's a good thing, interrelated with the rule of law and limited government. The rule of law means you have an actual rule, and it applies to Henri and Tom, not only to Henri or only to Tom. We have a rule, and it's applicable to everyone, and no one is above the law. No one gets exempted from it. The consequence is that law actually is a set of rules, that we know what they are and they guide our behavior. So we're not subject to the arbitrary power of another. The horror of slavery was that you were subject to the arbitrary power of a master who could do anything the master wanted, order you to do this or that, whip you, beat you, do terrible things to you. You are subject to the arbitrary power of this other person. That is a condition of absolute unfreedom.
Yeah.
Instead, when we are equally constrained, because of freedom also means a kind of constraint. For you and me
Yes.
both to be free, it means I'm constrained from hitting you, from reaching out and choking you, from stealing from you the awesome shirt that you have, for instance, very stylish.
Oh, thank
Uh,
you.
I'm not allowed to do that.
So there are
So
predefined rules or a set of rules that allow us to function in a mutually beneficial manner or hold ourselves to
definitely,
account.
it's both, but they don't have to be detailed. They're broad rules that you and I both understand. If everyone would know, if I were somehow to reach into the internet and grab your shirt and take it from you, that I had done an unjust and illegal thing.
Yes,
Everyone knows
absolutely.
that. You don't have to go to law school to understand that. And so that it means that my behavior is restrained. I can't do anything that comes into my head, like stealing another person's shirt. So it's equal restraint to enjoy equal freedom. We can't
Okay.
harm other people and engage in violations of their rights. But that means we can be equally free. And we're subject to laws that we generally understand, that in almost all of our interactions, we don't have to ask an expert. Sometimes we do about complex business transactions, but even then, we ask experts called lawyers to draft contracts so there won't be misunderstandings. That's one of the great things that lawyers do for us, is they make sure that Henri and Tom, when they're doing business, will not misunderstand each other.
Right.
And if there is a misunderstanding, there's a procedure to resolve it. Contracts are awesome, and they've evolved over time and grown so that they have elements that were tried and tested and shown to be useful over hundreds or even thousands of years. That is what makes possible our mutual freedom, our equal freedom. And when we both have equal freedom, including, and here's the key, what's known as the presumption of liberty, I am presumed to have the freedom to do anything I want unless there is a reason to show why I should not. And a good reason is it harms you. That's a good reason for me not to do that and not to be allowed to do that. But if it doesn't harm you, I should be able to do anything I want. So if I want to invent a new way to bake cakes or a new kind of driving app, right, a ride
Or
sharing
new
app,
fuel for planes or whatever, if you want to invent something that benefits society,
right,
education or new way of like thinking about science, thinking in science, all of that should be allowed. People should have the freedom to do that.
right. And
And it
without having
shouldn't
to
be
ask permission, permission is already granted.
right. But
In
Tom, the thing
contrast,
is, so Tom,
mhm,
you say that from a position where I think there's an understanding as to what these rights are, right? There's an understanding as to how humans should be treated. But in the context where that's not the case, because in Cameroon, when they disagree with you, they make sure you know. If it's the journalist turns up dead and they investigate it for the last 5 years and don't find the culprit, people they're all dying every single day, right? And in this context, how do we make the case that if people are free, other than us, because all we say is that if you keep killing journalists and you keep attacking NGOs and investigating them when they say something you don't agree with, investors are going to run away because investors don't like investors prefer the rule of law. They prefer
that's exactly my point. If
certainty.
you are subject to being taken out and murdered, you're being subject to the arbitrary power of another. That is not the rule of law. That's the rule of arbitrary power and violence. And that's the alternative to the rule of law. If you want a free and prosperous society, you need the rule of law, which means people are not dragged into the back alley and beaten or murdered. It means you don't get shut down because you annoyed somebody. You don't have thugs coming into your workplace and assaulting your colleagues. Those sorts of things. In many countries, that's just taken for granted. That's how things work. And the consequence is people don't enjoy freedom and they're poor.
Okay, well, Tom, we are going to, well, before we conclude, for our fellows who, these are graduates, professionals, what's the one advice you can give to them as individuals and as people who want to who champion liberty in the private sector, in the public sector, wherever they are? What's the what's your one advice for them?
So many things I want to say, but I only gave me one choice. And what I'm going to say is educate yourself in the basics of economic reasoning. It's so valuable. So books like Economics in One Lesson or Common Sense Economics by Gortney, Stroop, and Lee, Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, George Ite's book, Applied Economics for Africa. It's a little bit more technical, but it's very good. And learn economics not as a discipline like riding a bicycle or engaging in higher mathematics. It's a way of thinking. To think economically, you think about costs and benefits, you think about trade-offs, you think about unintended consequences, and that will benefit you in everything you do, not only as a policy analyst, as a public advocate, as a journalist, but also it helps to make life better when you begin to think about comparative advantage. Another way to think about comparative advantage, it's what can I produce at the lowest cost in terms of my other predictive activities? Or in a business, should you make or buy something? So car companies don't produce tires. They buy them from someone else. Why not? A tire is a part of a car because tire companies can make them cheaper. And in any activity, always be thinking make or buy as a trade-off. So my one piece of advice would be to spend the time with some good economics works and think through how to think like an economist.
Okay. Well, Dr. Tom G. Palmer, thank you so much for taking the time, and we hope we'll be speaking with you again very soon. Thank you.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much, Henri, and thank you to all those who'll be watching. What you're doing is very important for the future of your country.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye.
Bye.